So without further ado, I welcome Mark Bittman and turn it over to you all.
I want to say that I'm Mark, and I'm really inspired by what you're all doing, or what you all will do, so it's nice to be here. But you're a very impressive group, although you might not realize it, but it's true. Okay, shoot.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everyone, for being with us here today. This is an amazing opportunity for all of us to sit down with Mark Bittman. I know you all have lots of questions for him. We're going to ask that you save it to the end, and we'll make sure we have plenty of time for that. Okay, so let's jump right in. Mark, you established your legacy at the Times with the Minimalist column, and have since written an immense amount about food politics. What was the impetus for that transition, and could you speak a little bit about your evolution as a food writer?
How many questions do you have?
7.
I mean, I have to know, right?
That's it.
So in the 90s, it became clear, I was living in Connecticut, it became clear to me that I guess we could say food was not only about fun, which I'm not sure I realized before that. And in the backtracking, in the 80s, I thought, well, there's an interesting history about food and food in this country, and it's not just cooking. But in the 90s, it became clear that the food that was being sold to most people was not as good as it had been. And the supermarkets were worse than they were, and obviously fast food had become dominant, and no one was cooking. And I didn't know what to do with that because I was writing cookbooks, and I had just started writing the Minimalist column, which was obviously a great thing for me. Through the early 2000s, you had many people starting to write about policy and about agriculture and the ties between food and ag, which many people still don't get. I was a little bit jealous, frankly, but I still didn't see how I could fit that into my life. But by 2007, 2008, it became impossible to ignore that stuff. So I started to write for other sections of the Times besides the dining section, and I started to write about policy. And as soon as I started to do that, I thought, okay, writing recipes is great, and writing recipes is great, but there is this whole other world that I should not only should I not be ignoring, I should be focusing on. So I, long story short, finagled my way into getting an opinion column about food, which I think probably is the first opinion column about food in a major newspaper in the world, and has worked out pretty well. So the career-wise, it's meant a lot more, personally, it's meant a lot more work, and that's going to have to get figured out as I'm getting older. But from an interest perspective, I think it's really great to be able to tie recipes and cooking, which is such an important part of food, and which, as we all know, cooking is a sort of lost art, but one that it's not like sewing. It's one we can't afford to ignore. So I think that, that teaching cooking and encouraging cooking is a really honorable thing to do, those of you who are involved in that. But I think it's equally clear that we have to talk about ag policy, we have to talk about food policy, we have to talk about hunger, we have to talk about climate, we have to talk about the environment, all of these things that food, fall under the rubric of bailiwick of food, and it's obviously a real privilege to be doing that, especially for the Times, so yeah.
Great. So you mentioned that part of the impetus for this change was that you needed to find a link between food and ag. And you have a room full of people working on ag policy and Farm Bill advocates. So the Farm Bill is the largest piece of legislation, and it directly affects the most amount of people of any other bill. So it looks like we'll finally be seeing it passed, maybe, sometime soon. I don't know. So if you could redesign the Farm Bill, what would it look like specifically in terms of maybe SNAP, crop insurance, subsidies? What are the big pieces you would want to change?
I'd probably double the funding for SNAP. I'd eliminate subsidies. I'd modify the crop insurance program. What else do you want me to fix in the farm bill?
Let's see.
I would go way farther than the FDA just did on its antibiotic ruling, in which it recommended that people don't use antibiotics prophylactically in the raising of animals. I would make that illegal. I would make what we would call, I suppose, industrial. Let's cut to the chase. Here are the three big things in food right now are food security. That is, 1 in 4 Americans occasionally goes to bed hungry. There are 50 million people on food stamps, which is a sixth of the population. There should be more, not fewer. That is, there are people not on food stamps because they don't know they could be on food stamps. There's probably 9 fraudulent people on food stamps in the entire country, or maybe 90, but it's not a big problem, and there's not enough money for that. So that's one issue. The second issue is our diet is terrible. The biggest culprit in that, in my opinion, is sugar-sweetened beverages and junk food in general, but sugar-sweetened beverages is enemy number 1 in a way, and there's no one knows how to address that issue exactly, but my opinion is that if we try a soda tax and see that it fails, we can go on to plan B, but I think we need to try a soda tax. And then the third thing is we raise and eat way too much meat, and this has, I shouldn't even say meat, too many animal products, and this has an incredibly detrimental effect on our diet, on nutrition, although meat is or can be a part of a sound diet, not 600 pounds a year of animal products per person. But the real detriment here is environmental damage and even climate change, and that needs to be adjusted too. And you could affect all of that stuff through a good farm bill. It's not going to happen, but you could. There are indications, and this little FDA antibiotic thing, which is not irrelevant, there are indications that the Obama administration is going to try to do things in the world of food and ag that don't have to go through Congress in the next couple of years that are positive. We'll probably know whether that's actually true in the next 6 months, because they've been saying it for a year. And now, in 2 years they're lame ducks, so they only have a 2-year window here. So we'll see.
So which of those pieces would you recommend for policy advocates to focus their energy?
Well, I think it depends where you're working, right? Obviously, if you're working, if you're a social worker, if you're working with WIC, as someone is here, you want to focus. And WIC is an example of WIC is a far more successful and intelligent program than food stamps. Not as big, obviously, but demonstrably more successful by the numbers. And by the way, WIC, everybody says, or not everybody says, but there's an argument to be made that we should not allow food stamps to buy junk food or soda or whatnot, just as you can't use food stamps to buy cigarettes. And everybody says, oh, but that's paternalism, that's nanny statism, blah, blah, blah. But of course, the WIC program has very specific foods that you are allowed to purchase with WIC. So anyway, what everybody has in common is that we have to get decent people into the House of Representatives to be able to make long-term change. Then as you break things down, if you're a parent and you're not directly involved in food, I think school lunches and school food is a big deal. So is community food. If you're in the social services, obviously, hunger is a big issue. It's very hard for individuals to work on national issues like subsidizing fruits and vegetables instead of subsidizing corn. But one could see about San Diego becoming the first city in the United States to have a soda tax, for example, or there are cities and programs that double the value of food stamps when they're used to buy fruits and vegetables at farmers markets or just used to shop at farmers markets. There's all kinds of stuff that can be done locally, I think, as a friend of mine once said, there's plenty of good work to do. So it's not a question of like, oh my God, I can't figure out what there is to do. It's a question of where's your passion, what do you think is most important, and there's always someone who's going to let you volunteer or maybe even hire you to do it. Maybe.
So I think a lot of the people in this room have a passion for anti-hunger legislation. What advice would you give to those of us working on the front lines of food security and public policy?
It's funny. You can boil every discussion down to electoral reform if you want to. And I do think that everybody who cares about social justice needs to spend some time making sure that trying to make sure that their congressperson is intelligent. And I think that's we have, 438? What's the number? Whatever the number is, 538. Congress people, and half of them at least are idiots. So we have to fix that. There's gerrymandering. You could very easily give up because there are gerrymandering rules. Thank you. There are is it Gatorade? There are gerrymandering rules that make it very difficult to change who your congressperson is, but I think, honestly, everybody who's involved in this, who wants to be involved in this, should be spending 6 months out of every 2 years using all their free time to work on congressional elections. I don't know how else you're going to affect the next food bill, which in theory is due in 2015 because we do it every 5 years, right, or 2017, and it's taken 2 years to get this one through. This farm bill is really terrible, and it's the best farm bill we could possibly get. So everybody's celebrating that we have the least terrible farm bill that we could get, but it's pretty terrible. And similarly, I don't mean to keep harping on this, but it is big news. The FDA's ruling on antibiotics is a positive step, but it's such a tiny positive step that it's almost a negative step. But I'm trying to figure out, I'm going to be writing about this week. I'm trying to figure out if Congress announces tomorrow that they're raising the minimum wage, and then they say, yeah, but we're raising the minimum wage. We're raising the minimum wage. Everybody goes, yeah, by 10 cents an hour. Everybody goes, There's a way in which passing legislation or initiating regs that don't do very much just kick the can down the road. So if the FDA says, well, we're going to do voluntary restrictions on antibiotics, blah, 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 the FDA is not going to come out 2 months from now and say, okay, now we're forbidding antibiotics. They're going to wait 3 years. They just announced they're going to wait 3 years for the next move. So basically, very little is going to happen in the next 3 years. So FDA needs, these agencies are not inherently evil. FDA needs more mandates. It needs to be more clear to them what people want. Same with USDA, same with EPA, same with Health and Human Services, all these other agencies, and their direction is going to come basically from Congress. And it really does boil down to who's your congressperson. Because if we had 300 good congresspeople in there, it actually would look like a different country. It really would. And especially with a president who I think was originally inclined to be progressive. Who knows? But I mean, it may still be inclined to be progressive, but doesn't have, obviously he's not a czar. He's just the president. So if you have a progressive Congress and a progressive president, it would look like a different place. Right now it's like 6 old men in the Senate who are saving our ass every day.
So this sentiment of bills being passed that are sort of like a little nod to good but mostly bad was reflected in a quote that the Times published earlier this week in an op-ed. It stated, "We have gone from a war on poverty to a war on the poor."
That's very good. I could have written that myself. I was thinking about that the other day. When did it become a crime to be a poor person? When
Right.
did we start hating poor people?
Yeah. Exactly.
Andy and I were talking in the car on the way over about Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, which I can't remember. But I know one was freedom from fear and one was freedom from want. And so there was an actual principle that people in the United States had the right to not want, to not go hungry. And now I think the principle now is we're going to try to make the market work so well that everybody has a job that so that they can afford to buy food, which is obviously not working very well. But was there a question there? Yeah, it sucks that it's now become a crime to be poor. Yeah.
Do you see that sentiment reflected in food policy in any?
Well, I think the fact that we consider it a victory that food stamps is only being cut by 10% answers that question.
Mm-hmm.
Food stamp budget needs to be increased. I mean, the individual allotment needs to be increased, and it needs to be probably people at slightly higher incomes should be able to get food stamps. And certainly there should be enough food stamp outreach workers. Has anyone here ever done any food stamp outreach work? I mean, it can only be the toughest job in the world. And if there were more food stamp outreach workers, then it would become clear how great that need is. Am I right?
Great. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We want to talk about movements. We've seen this national momentum around the food system, from organic and locavores to sustainable farming to Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign. And we've seen these connections between a healthy diet and a healthy environment. So we wanted to ask you, what tactics would you use to capitalize on that momentum, and how do we scale it up to the next level?
It's a really great question. I don't have a pat answer there. I do think that the old revered food people really had the really old revered food people understood perfectly the relationship between food and the farm, because they all grew up in the country and they all grew up cooking. But chefs until 10 years ago had no understanding, and then their interest was, how can we get the best ingredients possible? That's not a particularly progressive stance. And the fact that there's still we could call it the Brooklyn contingent, although it's unfair to Brooklyn, but we can only get away with it because we're here. But the fact that there are so many people who are into food and like me in the 80s don't see beyond the relationship between food and good taste and fun and want to discuss, what the Brix level is in the wine they're drinking, or where this food is from and exactly how it was raised, but don't see that there are something like 600 million acres of fertile farmland in the center of the United States that's supplying all of us with most of our calories, and a lot of them are junky calories. That's a link that has to be made and hammered again and again and again. So if you have, it doesn't sound like anyone in this room is like that, but if you have friends who are effete foodies, they need to be, it's nice that people are into food. That's great. Farmers markets, very cool. I get it. We want to support the small farmer. All of that's great. But we need to have the big farmer be producing food that's good for all of us, because it's going to take that as well. Having said all of that, there are all these people deeply involved in agriculture who have no sense of the aesthetics of food and don't know anything about what good food actually is. They're just producing stuff. So if corn is where the money is, they're going to produce corn. If that switches to broccoli, they'll produce broccoli. They don't care. And they probably won't eat much of either. But this link is the key link right now, the link between food and ag, because it is also the link between diet and environment, as you say. And those things are really important. How we grow this thing, 10 years ago, maybe even 5, this event wouldn't have existed. So next year, do it again with 200 people, the year after that, 500, and so on. That's how we grow it. It's growing. I think there will be a tipping point. I'm just making this up, but my gut feels like 3%, 5% of the United States sees these links we're talking about, sees the importance of agriculture and food, sees the importance of food and diet and the environment, sees the importance of agriculture and diet and environment, so on. And when 10 or 15% of the country sees that, we're going to be looking at a much different situation. And 10 years ago, it was half of 1%, Before Food Inc., before Michael Pollan, I'll take a little credit, but those were the two big things.
Yeah, and I know in the past you've written about linking the food movement to the anti-smoking campaign in this country. Could you speak a little bit about that cultural shift and how we could apply that to this foodie movement?
Yeah, I will do that, but we should also talk about the food movement and the environmental movement. One important piece of my work, I think, is to help to try to define food. And this actually happened, I brought this up a little while ago, this actually happened 2 or 3 years ago when there was a fight between New York City Health Commissioner Tom Farley, great guy, and the anti-poverty people or anti-hunger people in New York. And the city was arguing that food stamps should not pay for sugar-sweetened beverages, and the anti-hunger people were saying, this is paternalistic, this is telling poor people what they can and can't do, and so on down the line. I sort of touched on this before, and I don't want to get into the argument. But what became, but what became clear to me, sitting in this panel that day, was that the key to this was to define food. So what's food? And that's a very, very, very deceptively complicated and interesting question. So what's food? Well, food provides nourishment. Well, what's nourishment? Well, nourishment helps you grow, not fatter, but taller, bigger, stronger, smarter. That's what food and nourishment is about. And it's not even true only for people. It's true for animals and plants also. Food is what nourishes you. Nourishing you makes you healthier. It's stronger. It doesn't make you weaker and less healthy. So if you consume something, it makes you weaker and less healthy. By definition, it's not nourishing, and by definition, it's not food. So sugar-sweetened beverages, and we can have a discussion about French fries and Snickers and a whole cheese doodles and a whole host of other things, all of which have some nutritive value, but they're not mostly nutritive. But sugar-sweetened beverages have zero nutritive value, and they're harmful. So to me, it was like, that's the end of this discussion. Food stamps can't pay for this stuff any more than they can pay for cigarettes. So that's one argument about food and cigarettes. The other is, what happened with cigarettes? What happened with cigarettes is it was first, discovered's not the right word, but the relationship between cigarettes and disease, specifically lung cancer, was described in the 30s. It took 30 years from that point until the United States Surgeon General came out and said, cigarettes are bad for your health. It took 35 years from that point until the attorneys general of the various, I think it was 48 states, made the deal with the tobacco companies, that really has curbed smoking in this country. And there were steps along the way. But what happened in 98, I think it was, when the deal was cut with the tobacco companies, was the tobacco companies basically agreed to pay for their own, if not demise, then the detriment of their own business model. And certainly they've recovered, they've invested elsewhere, they're still trying to sell cigarettes, that's for sure, and they're selling a lot more cigarettes abroad than they ever sold here. And in a way, as usual, we've exported our problems. Whole other topic, obviously. But if you say, okay, this industry is producing a product that's harming our people, what's the best way to get them to stop doing it? So you negotiate with them, as Michelle Obama is famously doing, but they will deny and they will stall and they will obfuscate and they will take 65 years, if they can, to maintain their current levels of production. And then eventually, just as the antibiotic producers will do now, they'll look for different business models and look for different ways to sell their stuff and look for different ways to make money selling other stuff. The justification for high taxes on cigarettes is exactly the same as the justification for high taxes on soda. You're going to see it in your lifetimes. You may not see it in the lifetimes of people my age because it may take 30 more years, or it's going to happen in Mexico January 1st. So could happen anytime. Talk about the relationship between the environmental movement and the food movement.
Yeah.
I mean, this is actually very short. I'm sorry, but these are not, this is stuff I think about all the time, and they're not glib I mean, if you wanted glib answers, we could have done 300 questions in 30 minutes, and it would have been kind of interesting, like speed dating, speed questioning. I just want to say two things. The food movement really should be a part of the environmental movement, and the environmental movement needs to recognize, A, that agriculture is, if anything, more important than conservation. You can put 10% of the land in the United States in conservation, and if 90% of it is being screwed by development and agriculture, you're not doing that great. Having a sane form of agriculture that would steward the land is more important than conservation. So that's one thing a lot of people in the environmental movement are not saying, or you won't hear them say. Another thing is that arguably agriculture is as big a contributor to global warming as energy. And you can screw around with these numbers and you can say agriculture is more important than energy, or you can say, oh no, agriculture is much less important than energy. But the big three are agriculture, energy, and transport, and agriculture is bigger than transport, that's for sure. And the environmental movement people almost never talk about ag. They always talk about energy, and it's good that they're talking about energy. Certainly it's a big issue, and I talk about energy some also. But that the more we start to bring these movements together, the food justice movement, the food and environment movement, the good food movement, the environmental movement, the conservation movement, etc. The more that we bring these groups together, under some kind of umbrella, I don't know what it is, the sooner we're going to get change on all of these fronts, because they're all related. You are not going to save the environment without fixing agriculture, and you are not going to have good food without reducing global warming or without caring about the environment. It can't happen. They're too closely linked. So the cool thing about food is that all of us can fix our diets at least a little bit. We can all, especially if we have money, we can all eat pretty well. Even if we don't have money, we can eat a smarter diet. That's really great, but it's an individual solution and you can only take it so far. You can be eating a really good diet, but it's not going to save the fish in the sea, it's not going to save the soil, it's not going to save the air. So the movements are important.
So it sounds like you're saying that food systems change has to be multifaceted. It doesn't really exist in isolation. It's sort of influenced by a lot of different sectors. Farm worker rights have as much to do with it as like myplate.gov, for example. So you have this room of people on the front lines in this. So how do you think we can make this an indelible part of the message that this change has to happen in a variety of sectors in order to impact any one of them, and which of the sectors should we engage first?
Well,
who are the easiest allies?
I don't think you all have to I don't think we all have to sit around all the time talking about the links between one thing and another, because you can only work, just as I can only write one column a week. I can't even write one column. I can only write one column every so often. And it's got to be on sort of one topic. You can't write Das Kapital or The Wealth of Nations every week and come up with this global scheme that explains the way the economy works and now we're all part of it. It can't be done. So you just mentioned farm workers' rights. I think it's really important when people are talking about the right to food, or when people are talking about how we want to take care of the earth, that we remember the people who work in, not just on farms, but in food service. And that brings you, of course, to the whole question of labor, because why would you care if a retail worker at McDonald's made $6, $8 an hour and not care if a retail worker at Target made $6 or $8? I mean, it's the same struggle, and all of this stuff is tied together. I had another friend, I like to quote my friends, I had another friend who would always say, it doesn't matter what you do as long as you do something. And I think we may have small disagreements among us on some issue or other that we're discussing here, but I bet that everyone in this room could agree with most everyone else in this room on 80% of the stuff in this world that we're talking about, and we know what the issues are, and it doesn't matter which one you're working on. Remember that the issues are related, and remember that you agree with your brothers and sisters about this stuff, and don't forget that when you're talking about the shitty food at McDonald's, you're also talking about how badly the workers are being treated at McDonald's.
It's a great segue into this next question. You wrote an article breaking down the cost of junk food for a family of 4 versus the cost of a healthy meal for dinner. And you actually argued that you can buy healthy food for cheaper than junk food. So given the high rates of obesity among low-income communities, could you explain a bit like some of the challenges of eating a healthy diet if it's not, in fact, an issue of cost?
It's, I said twice that I think food stamps should be boosted, and they should, but if you know how to cook, you could live on a food stamp budget. So the answer to that question is, how do you teach people how to cook? And the answer to that question is, well, you have cooking classes. So this solution, the solution to people cooking is not going to happen in my generation, although I'm old enough, and the handful of other people in this room who are as old as me are old enough to have grown up when people were still cooking. So we actually have that feeling of, oh yeah, we used to cook dinner at home here, my mom cooked at home 7 nights a week. Then we're not going to see the solution, we're not going to be the solution, and neither, I don't think, are you, although I'm not saying it's a waste of time to try to teach people who are in their 30s and 40s, even 20s, how to cook. But people, it's harder to, as we all know, it's harder to change as you get older, and it's harder to change your habits as you get older. Older people can be taught how to cook, and older people can cook some, but the real value in that is in setting a role model for your kids. So older people should cook, older people need to cook, older people, there should be resources for older people to be taught how to cook. And when I say older, I mean parents, they could be 26. But the real key to getting cooking back on the agenda is having the 4-year-old in your kitchen at least watching, and having the 8-year-old with his or her hands on the food. And that's how it used to be. And as I said, cooking is not sewing. We're not going back to making our own clothes. But whether our clothes are made by machine or made by hand does not affect our health. And I'm sure there's some obscure arguments about why we should be making our own clothes, but it ain't happening. But whether we cook our own food or not does affect our own health. And the cooking of the importance of cooking can't be overstated. I tend to understate it because I spent so much time talking about it for 20, 25 years that I'm sort of sick of it. But when a question leads into it, I remember, oh yeah, this is fundamental. This is really fundamental. And whether you're teaching kids how to cook or working on teaching kids how to cook or teaching adults how to cook, it's all good. Make the farm bill a food bill and put cooking classes, in every, the solutions start very simply, but they're impossible to get done. But if you tax soda and junk food and you use that income to subsidize fruits and vegetables, and you distribute those subsidized fruits and vegetables to people in schools and other libraries, which are losing their function in a way, in other places that are central to towns and central to suburbs, places that it could amount to community centers, it then becomes a $50,000 or $100,000 investment to put in a demonstration kitchen in that community center and give cooking classes, which could be taught by volunteers. I mean, if there's no money for it. But there has to be some money in here somewhere. And if you say to people, we now have a CSA at your elementary school, we're not calling it a CSA, we're calling it the fruit and vegetable pickup, because CSA is for rich people. So you can now pick up your cheap fruits and vegetables from local farms at your elementary school Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, Tuesday and Thursday nights, whatever, and we're giving cooking lessons at the same time. How this is not a good idea is beyond me. I mean, you have to be nuts to argue against that, I think.
So the process of educating people about food can get kind of fuzzy. Once you get over the first hump, like you should cook for yourself, there are a lot of issues that people kind of trip over. So Mark, it's such an honor to have you here, and I've dreamt about asking you this question in person. If you had to choose, would you buy a local apple or an organic apple?
I've thought about this.
Me too.
It depends on the local app. It depends on both things. But if you're asking me if I would rather buy a well-raised but maybe occasionally sprayed local apple versus an organic apple from South Africa, I want the local apple. If you're asking me if I'm going to buy a heavily doused with chemical local apple from maybe Bakersfield, or I guess apples are from further north in the valley, but you get what I'm saying, versus an organic apple from Oregon, I want the organic apple. So it's not that simple a question. Generally speaking, I favor local over organic, but generally speaking, A, it's not a choice, and B, the real choice is this. Do you eat the apple or do you eat the cheeseburger? You eat the apple. And that's the choice that people are making. Eat the apple. I don't care if there's pesticides on it. Wash it, peel it, whatever makes you comfortable. Eat the apple and leave the cheeseburger aside. First, let's make those choices, because that's the big choice. Plants or junk food or animal products. The more we eat plants, the sooner everything gets better. The more we fuss about, because you could have asked me, organic cheeseburger or not organic, or local cheeseburger, and then the answer is really, don't eat the cheeseburger.
So Mark, you've made the choice to eat the apple most of the day. Your new book, VB6, Vegan Before 6, espouses a vegan diet.
Semi-vegan, although vegans will argue that there's no such thing, but semi-vegan.
So why did you decide to write this book versus, let's say, a book about eating a plant-based diet?
Well, it is a book about eating a plant-based diet. It happens to be the way I eat, and I like rules. So I made a rule for myself that I would eat very strictly before 6 and then do whatever the hell I wanted after 6. But the problem really lies in the fact that the word vegan is inadequate to describe what I mean. And I'm now associated with this term VB6, which I quite like actually, and it is how I eat. But you can eat French fries and Coke for lunch and be VB6. So then the term vegan becomes inadequate. Because what I really mean is eat as close to an unprocessed plant-based diet as you possibly can before 6. And you know, I think if you're like a person who needs to have a glass of milk for lunch, or half and half of your coffee, or you know, God, you know, you've had an egg for breakfast every day of your life, and damned if you're going to change that. That's far less important than that you move towards a plant-based diet, and that you move towards a plant-based diet that isn't heavily reliant on Coke and Snickers and French fries and other plant-based foods that are obviously either not really food or very close to being not really food. It's all, you know, I'm sitting here thinking none of these answers is simple because it's all nuanced. But the simple answer is almost everybody in the United States should be eating more unprocessed plants and less of everything else. You could stop right there. That could be the whole discussion. Wouldn't be very entertaining, but that could be the whole discussion.
Thanks. So we have a room of food activists here. Everyone's eager for your advice. So do you have any examples of exciting projects or nonprofits?
Don't you think you should be letting them ask questions?
It's coming,
Okay.
I promise. Do you have any exciting projects or organizations that you'd want to share with us that could possibly be replicated here in San Diego?
Wow. You know, I should be able to answer that question. I very much like the idea of being able to use food stamps to buy fruits and vegetables and enhancing their value. And that has happened the USDA has backed that program on an experimental basis, but there are cities that have actively gone out for funding and made that happen in their cities. And that's a really good thing. I would say whatever city passes a soda tax first in the United States is getting a Medal of Honor. So you could be working on that, of course. There's this Blue Zones project. Is anyone here from relatively Northern California? That is LA. There's this Blue Zones project where these people are going into cities, and I say LA because Huntington Beach, I think, is one of these cities, or Hermosa or Manhattan, one of those big communities. They're going into the city and they're raising money from the city and raising money from private individuals and raising money from foundations, and they're trying to turn the city into a healthier place. So they're building sidewalks where there are not sidewalks, bike lanes where there are not bike lanes, supermarkets where there are not supermarkets, cooking classes, subsidizing farmers markets, sort of wellness classes, walking clubs. I mean, all the little stuff that you can think of when you think what makes a healthy community. And I think that's a good thing. But again, your passion's got to dictate what it is you're going to do. I'm not going to say, oh, everybody in this room needs to go blah, blah, blah. I did say everybody in this room should be involved in congressional politics, but you're going to think, congressional politics. That's fine. Your passion's going to dictate what you do. And I cannot keep, there's 20 programs represented here. I mean, I cannot keep track of, I probably get 40 emails a day from people doing really amazing work. I can't even keep track of a tenth of that stuff. So this Blue Zones thing sort of popped out at me because it was holistic, but is it the best new program that's going on? I have no idea.
Okay. Thank you so much. We're going to open it up to audience questions, so go wild.
I can tell you this. First person who raises their hand gets to answer their question. The last person doesn't. So.
I'm curious about, I've not read your book, but the vegan before 6 thing, why do you stop at 6?
Because I want it to be doable. because A, I want it to be doable, and B, I don't think people need to be 100% vegan. And I don't think, frankly, more than 5% of the United States ever will be, unless there's a catastrophe that prevents us from eating animal products. But I think animals are part of a healthy agricultural system, and I think animal products can be part of a healthy diet. It's just not the way it's happening now. Who's calling on people?
Juliana.
Look, you even know people's names.
Oh, yeah.
I really appreciate what you were saying about cooking, but in that, in your comments, I didn't really hear anything about family and consumer sciences or reinstating home ec, and they really seem kind of far out of the picture at the moment, and they still exist in the Midwest, and I was curious what you thought about really combining them and reinstating them.
No one wants to call home ec anymore, you know? Is family consumer sciences the new name for home ec? That's worse. I would go visit a school in the Midwest where they still do home ec. I'm not aware of that, and maybe you can clue me in. I would do that. I think cooking should be taught everywhere. So if I didn't say, yes, we should be teaching cooking in schools, it's just an omission. By the way, I think we should be teaching art and music in schools too, but schools, it's, you know, this is part of our congressional problem, the school system. But just a little bit of history. When I was in 8th grade, so that's like 1963 or 4, the girls had home ec and the boys had shop. My friend Kenny still has this amazing tin bank. He made out of tin snips and solder and all this cool stuff. And the girls know how to cook. So, you know, they got the better end of the deal. But then we did go through this period, and God knows, we have not exactly resolved the problem of sexism, but we did go through this period where men thought cooking was women's work, and women thought it's not going to be my work, and so no one cooked. And that, you know, that's not to say that women weren't right in rejecting what was a chore that had been thrust on them, but now we have to get past that. So obviously, home ec needs to be gender neutral, I guess is the family consumer sciences needs to be gender neutral. And I think that you know, we are, I don't think there's as much of a stigma among males about cooking as there was when I was young, and I hope that we can see that reflected in the long run.
Anahid?
Yeah, this is related, I guess. I don't know that there's so much of a choice with families. You know, the economy changed, and then it required a 2-household income, and now we're talking about, you know, five incomes coming together and not even being cobbled together.
Right.
And not even, so how do you? Cooking takes time. How do you balance that?
Well, watching TV takes time too, and we watch more TV than any country in the world. So I would say it's a question of priorities. There is some individual responsibility here. I mean, I'm not big on blaming the victim, but you have to want to be healthier. You have to want to eat better in order to do that. Part of that is education, and part of it is opportunity. But part of it is also, there's a decision at some point to be made.
Talking about cooking and education, what is the role of the television cooking shows and cable channels? Threat or menace, or do they have a role to play? Or
I'd say it's mostly been negative, except people sort of care about food a little more maybe, but no, I'd say it's mostly been negative. I mean, turning cooking into a spectator sport, that's a mistake. And that, you know, I think that goes back to what you were just saying. There has to be a feeling that cooking is a part of life. That's not something that's going to happen overnight. But if you value a healthier life, and if you value taking care of your kids, there has to be a point at which cooking works its way into that. I'm not saying that it's easy, and I'm not saying people have enough time. As I said, you can make an argument that everything boils down to electoral reform because people need to be making more money. No two people should be working 5 jobs, and especially in so-called cities, forgive me, like San Diego and Los Angeles, where if you're poor, you don't have a car, it takes you 2 hours to get to work, and if you're going to 2 jobs, that means your commute could well be 6 hours a day plus 12 or 14 hours of work. That doesn't leave a lot of time for sleeping, let alone cooking. You know, it's almost like I want to say, that's not my problem. People need to make more money. That's not a food issue, but it becomes a cooking issue. Because if you don't have any time, it's true, you can't cook.
Min?
So first of all, I love reading your articles.
Thank
And I
you.
love how you do connect the ag and the environment and the diet. And so as we're developing a program, an educational program, do you have any examples of, we're trying to do the same thing, of educationally people who are making those connections, either nationally or internationally?
Obviously, I need a resource list. The answer is no, but I obviously have to think about that more. It should be a column, actually. I get so caught up in the, I think I don't do enough local work, and then when I do, it tends to be quite specific. So, you know, I could spend my whole life writing about New York, because there's, so then I think, well, I can't spend my whole life writing about New York, and then I go to Iowa. Well, actually, you could spend your whole life writing about Iowa. So it's actually more work than I can handle. So maybe I'm not doing it perfectly, but that's a shortcoming I'd like to fix. I would like to have a list of resources I could even hand to people. So I'll work on that.
Julie?
Would you care to comment on the paleo diet, or what's called the paleo diet?
I think that first, the real paleo diet is you're hunting and gathering. When you're hunting, you're striking out most of the time. So basically, you're eating nuts and berries and whatever else, roots and stuff like that, and getting
A lot of exercise.
getting a lot of exercise. And then you kill an animal and you sit around and eat for a week. Sounds great. The paleo diet as practiced by Atkins followers, or those who followed Atkins, which is don't eat any carbs, doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. I will say this though, if you find a traditional diet, a real traditional diet, and you can find a traditional diet and call it paleo, and that makes sense to me, it's just not the Atkins diet. But if you find a traditional diet and you stick to it, you're probably going to eat pretty well. This is the worst diet that's ever been created, our diet right now. It would be hard to do worse. It's really hard to do. You could only do more, but you can't do, feeding people stuff that's bad for them, that's quite the irony. But I would say that any tradition, the Mediterranean diet is the diet that's had the most work done on it, the most money spent on studies done on it. And the Mediterranean diet is as effective as any drug regimen in preventing heart disease, stroke, blah, 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 diabetes, and so on. If work were done on Asian diets, on South Asian diets, on Aboriginal diets, paleo diets, on the Mexican, traditional Mexican, Mesoamerican diet, and so on down the line, all of them would be just fine, I'm quite sure. The problem is when 100 years ago we started to introduce non-foods into the diet, and 50 years ago we started to make them so cheap and started, 60% of our calories come from processed carbohydrates. Beat that. We don't need any processed carbohydrates, and we're getting something like 60% of our calories from soda and donuts and hamburger buns and so on down the line.
Matt?
I was wondering what your take on soy, like tofu or soy milk products, which are vegan but also highly processed. So where does that kind of play in, especially if you're trying to be more vegetarian and replace some of these beef products?
Well, yeah, I think you need to back up a little bit because soy milk is steamed and crushed soybeans mixed with water and put through a strainer. I don't call that highly processed. Tofu is that stuff coagulated. So it's the simplest cheese. Tofu is akin to yogurt or sour cream or cream cheese. It's just coagulated soy milk. So put those aside. You want to talk about tofu pups? That's junk food. So it's how many ingredients is it? How traditional is it? What are those ingredients? It's a pretty simple rule. If there's stuff in there you can't pronounce, there's stuff in there you don't know what it is, there's stuff in there you'd have to go to a chemical supply house to buy. If you can't make it by yourself, you probably don't want to eat it. I mean, all of the highly processed soy products have high fructose corn syrup in it. That alone, I don't think high fructose corn syrup is the root of all evil, but I think its inclusion in a food pretty much guarantees you don't want to eat the food. Simple. A lot of questions.
You had talked about people getting involved in congressional activities and politics and working with elected officials, and at senior community centers we do a lot of that. And in my past, I actually worked on political campaigns until I left. And how do you see, and you talked about individual responsibility, but how do you see those of us in nonprofits or in the community working with policymakers trying to change policy to a healthier food system when you have an electorate that votes for them who often don't support those same initiatives? So it's kind of that horse and cart.
You got to work on the electorate. I mean, you know, people get elected because other people go around banging on doors and saying, you got to vote for my guy, I'm your friend, and I'm going to convince you to do that. I mean, at the end of the day, there still is power in grassroots. I'm not an expert on that stuff, but, you know, who was and is Barack Obama, and he got himself elected president. I mean, this was a guy who was a community organizer. He spent 0 time as a senator. He's as unqualified to be president as George Bush was. I mean, technically. And he went out there and figured out how to win this election. I'm not saying it's only Congress people. It's city council people. It's mayors. It's statewide officials. Change can happen on all these levels. And in a way, it's much easier to make change happen locally than it is to make change happen nationally. But then if you make change happen locally and it's good change, it's easier to convince people, well, you know, why are you voting for this Tea Party guy for Congress? What did they do? They fought Obamacare. Isn't that working for you? What?
Well, Dara Ice is the rep in this area.
Great guy. So in a way, your work is easy.
All right, we have time for one more question.
See what I meant about the first question, last question?
Mark.
So you started, the first discussion began by talking about the Farm Bill, and you have done some work on that, and obviously work on it the last couple of years. And a divisive issue that I see amongst people working in different parts of the Farm Bill is the crop insurance issue, direct payments, and you talked about subsidies early on. And so the divisive issue is, okay, so if you could cut these subsidies, what would then be, how would we then, through the Farm Bill, interact with those farmers who are currently doing commodity crops? Do we just leave them out to the market? Do we return to ever normal granary? What?
I mean, that's a pretty technical question, and it sounds to me like you know the answer better than I do. But it's okay. I'm not putting it back on you. I'm not avoiding it. It's fine. The subsidies, the direct payment subsidies, most of those go to wealthy people or wealthy farmers. Those we can eliminate. Crop insurance is a much more difficult question, I agree. But right now what's happening with crop insurance is that you're encouraged to grow corn every single, like that crack in the concrete there, if you could get a seed in there, you could grow corn in there. And if it fails, we'll take care of it. That can't possibly be the right policy. So who's who's benefiting from the overblown crop insurance policies are insurance companies and farmers who are planting stuff in places where it shouldn't be planted. And you can't blame them. It's the same old story. You know, corn is $7 a bushel or whatever it is. I'm tearing up my driveway. I mean, there are people in Iowa literally tearing up their driveways because that's a quarter of an acre of corn I can put in there. That kind of behavior can't be encouraged. So I don't know how you write a crop insurance policy. I think it's fair that farmers have some assurance that they're not going to go broke and lose their farms. But there's got to be something in between this and that. And you know, not to open a huge can of worms at the end of a discussion, farmers are really important, but other Americans are really important also. And you know, where's my crop insurance? You know, not to make this ridiculously personal, but it's as good an example as any, I buy disability insurance. You know, if I have a stroke tomorrow, no one's going to pay me to write articles after my stroke. So where's where's that for me? I don't have. Where's my writer's insurance? Where's everybody else's work insurance? I mean, it's not a good system the way it's set up now for farmers or anyone else.
Okay.
And on that note,
yeah.
Yeah, sorry. You could have tried to end on a more upbeat note.
Actually, I want
You could cut when you're editing the video. Just when you see Parker, it's like, okay, that's the end of it.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question because I feel like I have power right now.
This feels good.
Yeah, it's nice. What, in your opinion, is the greatest opportunity in food right now?
You mean what should...
Just your opinion.
No, but what do you mean by opportunity? For what people should do or what
For how young
should eat?
people could get involved.
Oh, that. The career advice. Not food writing. Yeah, I mean, in a way, it goes back to that. Wouldn't it be nice if all the people who are interested in producing food actually could produce food? Because that, if there were a Young Farmers of America program where there was land set aside and there was funding set aside for people who are interested in farming to start farming, that would be the best possible opportunity, because I think we'd really see a new generation of farmers who really did understand stewarding the soil, taking care of the land. But we don't have that. I think it's very hard to make, depends how you define food, but I think it's very hard to make a living in food right now, especially in the jobs that young people tend to romanticize. But you've all found some niche, so these are the opportunities. That's better. That's a better.
Yeah. Thank you. Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Okay.
Okay.